They called it the most ridiculous thing a cattleman could do before winter in Kansas, erecting a lone straw dome in the middle of a frozen plain while the weather reports started talking about a blizzard that could bring winds and cold, capable of killing anything left outdoors. Ethan Walker did it anyway, ignoring the mocking stares, the head shakes, and every warning that he was throwing his hard work into a foolish idea. The young stock was led into the ridiculed structure just as the sky turned a heavy lead gray and the Kansas wind began howling without pause. What no one knew at that moment was that in the days to come, as the entire Plains region fell into panic and loss, the very thing mocked as a joke would force even the most confident to stop and wonder why they had overlooked it. Ethan Walker knelt low inside his straw dome 3 days before the storm hit Kansas, his calloused hands tracing the rough curve of walls built from nearly 200 carefully stacked bales of dry straw. The structure wasn't tall, only slightly taller than a man at its center, but wide enough for a group of young stock to lie close together, with room for him to turn and check every gap where wind might slip through. Outside, the Ellsworth Plains stretched out in an almost suspicious flatness, the sky carrying a lead-gray hue rarely seen in Kansas winters. Kansas wasn't a state accustomed to long, heavy snow seasons, and most local barns were built to withstand spring winds, not to hold heat against a prolonged blizzard. Ethan's stock dog lay near the entrance, ears up, eyes fixed on the horizon where the wind shifted in unnatural jerks. That alone was enough to tighten his stomach. For the past week, Ethan had watched the sky with the accumulated instinct of years working outdoors when the cold no longer just brushed the skin but began to sink deep, heavy, and persistent. The Weather Service spoke more about dangerous, even life-threatening conditions, but in the small town, most people still saw it as the usual winter exaggeration that would pass quickly like every time before. Barns stayed open, wind still funneled through, and the belief that everything would be fine remained intact. Ethan didn't share it. The previous winter, a prolonged power outage had taken several young calves right inside barns considered safe. He couldn't forget the feeling of standing in the dark, hearing the wind scream through the cracks, knowing no equipment was fast enough to replace the heat being stolen away. That memory had led him to this straw dome, a project he began building when he realized that doing things the old way again would end the same. He had tried explaining it to his wife Laura the evening she caught him sketching rough curves on the back of a feed invoice. He talked about straw-trapped air animal body heat, a space independent of electricity or heaters. Laura listened, didn't ask if he was right or wrong, just placed her hand on his shoulder for a long moment before leaving him to his drawing and his decision. Community attention arrived faster than he expected. The day Ethan started stacking the first circle of straw in the empty field, a pickup slowed on the road. Caleb Morrison, owner of the largest ranch in the area, with modern barns and full equipment, rolled down his window and stared as if he couldn't believe his eyes. "What are you doing, Walker?" Caleb's voice carried half curious, half mocking. Ethan didn't stop placing another bale into the pre-measured spot. "Shelter for the stock," he replied. Caleb laughed, a dry sound echoing in the open space. With straw, he shook his head and drove off, but the story didn't end there. By afternoon, word had spread through town that Ethan Walker was wasting straw to build something that looked like a giant termite mound in the field. The next day, a few more trucks slowed as they passed, eyes curious mixed with pity. One stopped completely and warned that straw insulated well but burned easily, that a single spark could wipe everything out. Ethan wiped sweat from his brow in the growing cold and answered that inside there was no fire, no electricity, only the body heat of living animals. The reply made the man frown, as if Ethan were speaking some alien logic. But to Ethan it was clear. A group of young stock, each giving off a small amount of heat just by breathing and existing, enclosed in a sealed space with thick, multi-layer straw walls and no wind to steal heat, would create a more stable zone than any system, relying on electricity or fuel. When he placed the final bale and cut a low shielded entrance, almost the entire area knew about his straw dome. Caleb Morrison returned, this time with others standing with arms crossed, as Ethan led each young animal inside. The creatures moved slowly, breath steaming in the cold air, the dry straw smell enveloping them. "You'll lose them all," Caleb called, voice certain. Ethan straightened, looking across the frozen yard, neither angry nor defiant. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but I'm not doing it the old way anymore." As the truck drove off, the first snowflakes began to fall, light at first, almost unreal, touching Ethan's face like cold reminders that Kansas still believed everything would be fine, while he had staked his entire herd on what the community saw as a joke. The storm didn't wait for the originally forecast day. It arrived earlier, faster, as if the Kansas sky decided to collapse all at once. And in those first hours, Ethan Walker understood that everything was far beyond what the plains had ever experienced. The wind no longer blew in familiar gusts, but accelerated continuously, without rest, without break, like an invisible current pressing the earth, sweeping away everything in its path. Snow didn't fall straight, but was driven sideways, slamming into bodies, barn doors, thin metal sheets like sand, hurled by a giant hand. Temperatures dropped so fast that numbers on thermometers became meaningless to people who had never seen such deep cold in Kansas, where winters usually only froze the ground at night and thawed by day. This time was different. The cold didn't retreat when the sun should have risen. It stayed thick and heavy, combining with wind to pull heat from every surface faster than any heater could replace it. Traditional preparations began showing their limits within hours. Power flickered on and off. Lights in modern barns blinked like the fading breath of a tired body. Generators were pulled out and run nonstop, roaring in the wind, overheating from overload, burning fuel faster than planned. Heat lamps stayed lit, ventilation fans kept turning, but the wind was so strong that heat was sucked away the moment it was produced, turning expensive equipment into illusions of safety. In that flickering darkness, local radio became the only thread connecting stranded ranchers, and through the brief reports, bad news spread like a disease. Cattle dead in the northern county. Another herd nearly wiped out in a single night. Not from hunger, not from neglect, but from cold, pure, and ruthless. The most modern barns held power a few more hours until they too fell silent when the main lines were torn down by wind, leaving the final lights to snuff out amid the ringing of cold-shrinking metal. In many places, panic showed clearly: machinery running at full throttle, people shouting in the wind, restless cattle pressing against barn walls seeking warmth where none could be held. Amid all those sounds, a strange contrast existed at the storm's edge. In the empty field, Ethan's straw dome stood silent, no light, no noise, no sign of life or death inside. No wires to snap, no engines to fail, nothing making sound for the wind to swallow. That very silence made Ethan's worry grow with each passing hour. He stood in the house, listening to the wind scream through the walls, feeling the pressure change until his ears ached, knowing going out now was no different from throwing himself into a death trap. The wind was strong enough to knock a grown man down in minutes, snow deep enough to bury paths, temperatures low enough that any exposure could lead to irreversible frostbite. Ethan couldn't reach the straw dome, couldn't check, couldn't repair if something went wrong, and that ran completely against the instincts of a man used to handling every problem himself. He could only wait while each radio report added another number, another location, another proof that what was happening wasn't a normal tough winter but a real disaster. At other ranches, people watched cattle die, standing in barns, bodies stiff in the posture of seeking warmth. Feed still in the troughs, water still there, but cold had overcome every barrier. Barns designed for ventilation became heat funnels, and the very openness once praised killed the animals inside. Meanwhile, no one knew what was happening inside that straw dome. No one heard a sound, no one saw light, and Ethan had no way to confirm if his decision was right or wrong. Time passed slowly and heavily, each hour stretching like a day, every strong gust carrying the fear that the straw dome might have collapsed, that the air inside might have run out, that the silence hid an irreversible outcome. But the storm didn't care about human worry. It continued sweeping Kansas, forcing everyone into the same state of helplessness, where technology, experience, and money were tested to their limits. And while the entire plains struggled to hold on to what remained, only one thing needed: no electricity, no fuel, no blind faith that machines wouldn't fail at the worst moment, a straw dome standing silent in the storm, carrying all of Ethan Walker's hope and fear without revealing any sign of whether it would become salvation or just another mistake buried under snow. By dawn of the third day, the storm began retreating in the way only those who had lived long enough with weather could recognize, not by sudden disappearance, but by the wind ceasing its insane howling and shifting to a lower, heavier sound. Still dangerous, but no longer killing in minutes. Snow still fell, but no longer driven sideways with force enough to knock a grown man down, and in brief lulls between gusts, people could open doors, step outside, test the fragile line between enduring and risking. Ethan Walker stood on his porch a long time before deciding to put on extra layers, wrap his neck, pull his hat low over his eyes, because the mere thought that he could now reach the straw dome carried a fear hard to name. He had spent nearly 2 days trapped in helpless waiting, hearing radio reports of more ranches losing herds, watching the last lights from modern barns fade in the night. And throughout that time, the straw dome remained out of reach, both his only hope and his greatest obsession. The path to the field had almost vanished under deep snow, each step, heavy and slow wind, still strong enough to numb any exposed skin, reminding him that, though the storm had weakened, it could still punish the smallest mistake. When the straw dome came into view, Ethan had to stop for a long time to catch his breath, not just from the difficult trek but from the thoughts crowding his mind. The low entrance was buried in snow, leaving only a seamless white mass with the surrounding ground, and in that moment all the fears he had pushed aside for 2 days surged up at once. Suffocation if the air inside didn't circulate enough. Collapse if snow weight exceeded his calculations. Freezing if every assumption about body heat was just beautiful theory that couldn't survive reality. Ethan began digging with hands and shovel heavy layers of snow thrown aside in silence, no sound from inside answering. Each shovel stroke came with a faster heartbeat, and when the entrance finally emerged, he had to stop, place his hand on the tarpaulin cover, take a deep breath before pulling it aside. The moment wasn't loud or dramatic in the way people imagine, but it was enough to change everything. A wave of warm air poured out, not fierce heat, but a stable, gentle, clear warmth Ethan could feel immediately on his face, creating an almost absurd contrast with the skin-cutting cold outside. He stood frozen for a few seconds, as if his body needed time to believe what his senses reported. Inside the straw dome, the young stock still lay close together, their bodies not huddled in panic but relaxed, in a strange way, steady breath, forming faint clouds in the enclosed space. No frightened bellows, no chaotic movement of animals. Freezing to death, they were alive, not fragile and trembling, but stable as if the storm outside was only a distant sound unrelated to their small world. Ethan knelt, placed his hand on the inner straw, felt the steady temperature held within the thick walls. And in that moment, every calculation, every drawing, every explanation he had prepared to justify his decision became unnecessary. The contrast was too clear to argue. Outside wind still carried cold enough to numb fingertips in minutes. Inside, the space was stable to the point of near total silence, a silence not of death but of balance. Ethan didn't cheer, didn't call anyone, didn't feel the need to prove anything right then. He just sat there a little longer, listening to the steady breathing of the herd, as if needing to etch the moment into memory to be sure it was real. What happened in the straw dome wasn't a miracle, nor a personal victory over nature, but the stark manifestation of a simple principle overlooked for too long. When Ethan stood and pulled the tarpaulin back over the entrance, he knew the hardest part of the storm was over, not just for his herd, but for how the entire community would view what they believed was right. The straw dome didn't prove Ethan Walker was correct, because that was never the core issue. It quietly proved that the crowd in their familiar confidence had been wrong. When the first morning after the storm arrived, Kansas didn't wake to the familiar sounds of a new day, but to a thick, heavy silence that felt almost tangible. Snow blanketed everything from barn roofs to fences to the dirt roads, now completely erased under seamless white, making the familiar plains landscape alien as another place. No more wind tearing at ears like the previous days, but the cold remained lying still and clinging to every surface. Local radio came back on after hours of only brief intermittent reports, and this time the announcer's voice couldn't hold its usual neutrality. Damage reports were read in short, rapid bursts, dry numbers carrying the weight of what was lost. Within minutes, the first calls began spreading among regional ranchers. No one asked if anyone was safe. No one spoke of family or self, because everyone understood that if you could hear the phone ring, the people were still alive. What they needed to know now was only about the herds. Conversations were brief, curt, often just a few words reporting death counts like reading a cruel ledger. Cattle dead in closed barns, dead pressed against walls built to protect them, dead in the posture of seeking final warmth where it should have been safest. The bitterest part was that those most confident in their systems lost the most because their barns, though modern and sealed, couldn't escape the constant heat drain by wind until every heat source became useless. Amid that heavy flow of information around Ethan Walker's ranch, there existed an anomaly impossible to ignore. No call from him reporting losses, no sounds of machinery running full tilt to repair or clean up, no rush to drag carcasses out for burial before they froze solid. Ethan's ranch was eerily quiet, as if the storm had passed around it. That silence began drawing attention first as fleeting thoughts in a few minds, when they hung up after bad news, then gradually becoming a question hanging unspoken. People remembered the straw dome, the structure mocked for days before the storm, not out of curiosity or desire for gossip, but because every familiar explanation had failed. When sealed barns couldn't hold heat, when machinery and long experience collapsed before an unprecedented storm, only one thing remained that required no electricity, no fuel, no blind trust in technology. The community's attention began shifting in that direction, carrying a stunned feeling from the fresh losses, doubt about what had once seemed certain, and a quiet unease as people realized they might have overlooked the only remaining possibility. Not long after those frantic calls quieted, while Kansas still lay under deep, unmelted snow, and the post-disaster silence weighed on every ranch, Ethan Walker heard an engine approaching slowly on the road to his house, a sound different from the confident trucks that used to race past. The old pickup stopped at the edge of the yard, not parked straight as the habit of close acquaintances, but angled aside as if the driver was no longer sure he had the right to enter the center of this space. Caleb Morrison stepped out, no longer carrying the easy demeanor of someone who believed everything was under control. His thick coat was crusted with a thin layer of ice, the hem stiff from packed snow, his face gray and tired in a way impossible to hide. He brought no one else, no introductions or half-joking laughter like before, just stood there a few seconds, looking around. Ethan's quiet ranch, where no signs of the chaos many others were experiencing could be seen. When Caleb spoke, his voice was low and dry, no longer sharp, no longer the certain tone of someone who had mocked others. He didn't apologize, didn't say he had been wrong, because the pride accumulated over years didn't dissolve after one storm. He only asked the question, coming slowly as if it had to cross an invisible barrier inside him, "How are your cattle?" Ethan looked at the man before him, recognizing the change so clearly it needed no words. He felt no satisfaction, no need to use the moment to explain or prove anything. All the reasons, calculations, principles that had once made him laughed at were now irrelevant. Ethan answered with one short sentence, clear enough to be unmistakable, simple enough to carry no boasting they're still alive. No further explanation, no added details, because the fact itself was heavy enough. Caleb Morrison didn't argue, didn't ask more, didn't try to steer the conversation to retain any advantage. He stood still, hands at his sides, eyes sweeping the frozen yard, then settling somewhere toward the field where the straw dome stood quietly like proof that needed no words. In that moment, what collapsed wasn't just an opinion or a technical choice, but the long-held belief that money, technology, and accumulated experience were always enough to conquer nature. For the first time in his life, Caleb didn't know where he had been, right? Couldn't find any familiar argument to cling to, and the silence between them became longer and heavier than any previous argument. Ethan didn't break that silence because he understood this wasn't the time to say more. The truth had risen between them, stark and unyielding, forcing old pride to step back before new reality without any accusation or justification needed. After Caleb Morrison left in silence, Ethan Walker's ranch was no longer overlooked, and the change happened faster than anyone could prepare for. The second person arrived soon after, then the third, and more pickup trucks slowly advancing on the snow-covered road into the yard, carrying tired faces alike, eyes red from lack of sleep and images they hadn't yet forgotten after the task, storm. None of them asked Ethan why the straw dome worked. None wanted to hear principles or long explanations that days earlier might have made them laugh. The questions asked now were short and brutally practical. How much straw, how high, how to stack so it doesn't collapse. Desperation had swept away theoretical debate, leaving only the single need to keep the surviving animals alive through the cold days still not ended. That very day, the first straw domes began appearing scattered across the region, hastily built amid unmelted snow. Some were done right, thick, sealed straw walls, low, carefully shielded entrances. Some were done wrong, loose straw gaps too large for wind to enter, air not held. Some were built too big, as if the builder believed larger meant safer, only to fail because there wasn't enough body heat inside to maintain stability. Ethan went from place to place when he could not as a hero or leader, but as someone who had tried and luckily stood firm. He didn't preach, didn't say more than necessary, only repeated the basic principles he had relied on from the start. Keep it sealed, keep it low, keep it just right, and don't expect anything beyond what can be controlled. He emphasized over and over that there was no magic here, that the straw dome wasn't something that could fix every mistake or replace caution. Those words weren't always fully heard. In panic, some acted faster than they thought, built more hastily than needed, overlooking small details that in normal conditions might not matter, but in this cold became the line between life and death. The price of sloppiness came quickly and clearly. A few cattle didn't make it, even after being brought into straw domes, because the space wasn't tight enough or was too wide to hold heat. Those losses weren't as large as what happened in traditional barns earlier, but they were enough to remind everyone that the straw dome wasn't a talisman. It didn't save every wrong decision, didn't forgive carelessness disguised as urgency. Amid the bad news and rare survival stories, a strange emotion spread through the community, both hope and fear. Hope that there was still a way to lessen damage, that not everything was doomed. Fear because every mistake could cost the lives of the remaining animals. People began learning not from books or workshops, but from the small ongoing losses right before their eyes. And in the process, the straw dome gradually shifted from a ridiculed personal solution to a fragile but real anchor for the community trying to stand firm after the storm. As the first days after the storm passed and the frantic pace of salvaging what remained began to slow, harsh reality forced the region to face numbers no one wanted to hear. Damage reports were compiled through local channels, no longer scattered stories, but a cold, comprehensive picture in which hundreds of cattle died in just a few days, not from hunger, not from abandonment, but from cold beyond Kansas's familiar assumptions. What stunned many most was that the most modern barns, the places once held up as models of preparation and investment, suffered the heaviest losses. Solid walls, expensive heating systems, and sophisticated machinery weren't enough against the combination of wind and cold, and the very dependence on them cost many people precious time as they failed one by one. In the brief conversations left after the panic, Caleb Morrison's name was often mentioned as a painful example. He had lost more than half his herd animals that had been his pride and the foundation of his ranch. The survivors weren't saved by pure luck, but were left in a depleted state, visibly thinner, needing weeks or even months to recover if weather allowed. Caleb didn't talk much about the number, but the change in how he moved and the empty look when he gazed toward the empty barns said it all. Amid that bleak picture, Ethan Walker's ranch became an uncomfortable contrast, not because he suffered no loss, but because his decision had avoided the worst. Still, Ethan felt no reason to celebrate. He understood better than anyone that if his calculations had been off even slightly, if the straw dome hadn't been tight enough, if he had bet wrong, he himself would have been the one to kill his herd with an idea no one else trusted. That awareness kept him from seeing the outcome as a victory, because the cost of a mistake in this situation wasn't money or reputation, but life. No cheers, no full relief, only a slow exhale when realizing the disaster could have been far worse without other options tried. The numbers continued being read in later reports, each one a reminder that this storm left no winners, only those who lost less and those who lost more. In that heavy atmosphere, no one was in the mood to argue who was right or wrong, because cold reality had spoken for itself, merciless and allowing no fairy tale ending. The meeting took place on a cold, gray afternoon when snow still lay thick around the town's low buildings, and people entered the community room with a weariness more than expectation of anything new. No speaker's platform was set up, no list of speakers, no printed program handed out like past meetings. Chairs were arranged in a wide circle so everyone could see each other clearly, as if the seating itself said no one was here to teach anyone anything. The meeting was called urgently, not to find someone to blame or argue who had been right, but to face together the reality the storm left behind. Faces that once appeared confident at the feed store now carried quietness, eyes avoiding others' gazes, because everyone knew the words spoken before the storm had become empty. When those who had mocked the straw dome spoke, there was no noise or dramatic apologies like in stories people still tell. They spoke slowly, choosing words carefully, revealing little emotion beyond fatigue and simple acknowledgement that they had overlooked a possibility. No one tried to blame circumstances or wrong forecasts, because the storm had shown that the biggest mistake wasn't not knowing everything in advance, but believing the familiar would always be enough. In that room, the straw dome wasn't mentioned as a miracle or a saving invention. It was seen for what it was, a crude, imperfect solution that couldn't replace everything else, but had worked when familiar systems failed. A few asked questions not to argue, but to understand better about limits, about what could go wrong if done hastily, and the answers given weren't meant to convince but to warn. Ethan Walker sat in that circle as an ordinary participant, not standing, not trying to lead the conversation, because he understood the change happening needed no leader. Experiences were shared out of order, mixed with stories of loss and rare moments of saving herds, creating an incomplete but honest picture. Gradually, the room's atmosphere shifted from heavy to calm, from defensive to listening. People began talking about preparing differently, not by completely replacing what existed, but by expanding their thinking, accepting that sometimes the simplest solutions were most necessary when everything else collapsed. The meeting ended without official statements, without resolutions passed, but when people stood to leave, there was a shared feeling that something had shifted. Not certainty, but a fresh humility, the realization that they would have to relearn from the beginning, not as failures, but as people just reminded that nature doesn't care about reputation or habit, and that survival sometimes begins by admitting something seemingly too simple was missed. After that meeting, without a speaker's platform change didn't come through grand declarations or symbolic decisions, but through small, repeated, quiet but consistent actions, as regional ranchers began treating what happened as a lesson to be recorded rather than a painful memory to forget. Notebooks came out hasty, straw domes built in panic were remeasured, compared for which held heat better, which failed faster, and why. Numbers appeared instead of feelings. What diameter was right to hold enough air without being too wide? What height kept heat from rising too high, then escaping? How thick the straw needed to be, so wind couldn't pull heat through. Ventilation was discussed more carefully, no longer random gaps, but intentional small points enough to prevent stuffiness inside but not create convection currents breaking stability. Suitable herd size became an emphasized factor because painful experience showed that cramming too many animals into an enclosed space didn't increase safety but could create chaos and stress, leading to other consequences. These exchanges didn't happen in formal meeting rooms, but on barn steps beside still uncleared straw piles while people worked, talked, tried, and fixed. Gradually, the straw domes stopped being mentioned as a temporary measure for one specific storm and began being seen as part of the preparation process for extreme situations few had thought about before. Along with that came a deeper shift in thinking. Near absolute faith in solid barns and concrete, steel, and complex heating systems began being questioned, not to deny their value, but to acknowledge they weren't always enough. People started talking more about basic physical principles, about how air holds heat, the role of mass and shape, about minimizing heat exchange rather than trying to compensate with energy. It wasn't turning away from progress, but adding back a layer of understanding forgotten too long under the convenience of technology. Small failures in later experiments were no longer hidden or seen as shameful, but dissected for lessons, because everyone understood the cost of not learning would always be higher than admitting mistakes. In that shift, reason gradually returned, not as rigid self-certainty, but as the ability to look straight at reality, accept the limits of what was once considered certain, and prepare better for the next time. Not with vague hope that nature would relent, but with clearer understanding of how it works. When warmer days finally arrived and the sun gained enough strength to make the thick snow on the Kansas plains sag and gradually melt, that historic winter quietly retreated without leaving a clear boundary between disaster and normal. Meltwater flowed in small streams along fences, revealing soaked ground and deep tire ruts from urgent days, and with that change, the straw domes built in desperation began to be dismantled. People carefully removed each bale, no longer in a hurry as when building, because time had returned to its familiar rhythm. Straw was restacked in storage, returning to its original role as feed and bedding for livestock, as if the straw dome had been only a temporary winter dream. But not everything melted with the snow. What remained wasn't on the ground, but in the minds of everyone who had gone through that storm. The old way of thinking, once taken for granted and unquestioned, could not fully return to its original state. The belief that building strong enough barns, investing enough money, and equipping enough technology would control every risk had been cracked, even if not everyone was ready to admit it aloud. Blind pride, which had once made many dismiss other possibilities because they seemed too simple or crude, didn't vanish immediately, but it lost its absolute certainty. People continued repairing barns, planning the next breeding season, talking about new improvements, but beneath those conversations lay a new layer of reflection, quiet and persistent. Ethan Walker didn't keep the straw dome as a victory symbol or fixed solution. When dismantling it, he did so with the same attitude as when building, neither dramatizing nor nostalgic, simply completing a phase that had passed. He knew that if that winter had been different even slightly, if wind had shifted, if temperatures had dropped deeper, the outcome might not have been the same. That awareness made every conclusion more cautious, not allowing him or anyone else to close the story with a simple lesson. When the snow fully melted and the plains gradually regained their familiar colors, the real question was no longer whether the straw dome should be rebuilt, but whether this community was truly ready to change how they viewed risk. Winter had ended, but the questions it raised remained hovering between decisions for the future, forcing each person to answer silently what they would carry from that experience and what they were willing to leave behind with the melted snow. When the straw dome no longer stood on the field, when its traces remained only in the memories of those who had stood there during the storm, the story seemed formally closed, but its influence did not disappear with the bales stacked neatly in storage. With no specific structure to point at, no strange image to mock or praise, what remained was a much harder to grasp change lying in how this community talked to each other and to nature itself. People no longer laughed too quickly at ideas that went against habit, nor rushed to reject crude-looking solutions just because they didn't fit the image of progress. Later conversations, whether about building new barns or preparing for the next winter, carried a new caution, a short pause before concluding, as if everyone had learned that the cost of overlooking a possibility could sometimes be too great to dismiss. Ethan Walker returned to his daily work, not keeping the role of leader or symbol of innovation, because he understood that the most important thing wasn't who was right in one specific winter, but whether each person was willing to adjust their thinking when circumstances forced it. He didn't tell this story as a triumph, nor use it to justify every future decision, because the experience itself had taught him that no solution was correct in every situation. The straw dome no longer existed, but it left a lasting mark, reminding that survival sometimes depends on daring to try something different when everything familiar fails. Looking back on that winter, people might not remember exactly what the dome looked like, or how many bales it used, but they remembered very clearly the feeling of crossing the boundary between certainty and doubt, between blind faith and clear-eyed observation. And at that simple ending there was no lesson carved in stone, only an ordinary thought quietly spreading over time. Sometimes what is called ridiculous isn't wrong, but obvious, and no one was desperate enough to try it until circumstances forced people to look again at what they had mocked and realize that right there they had found a way out. If this story has given you a different perspective on survival preparation and things that seem ridiculous, please subscribe to the channel to continue joining us in the next stories. Thank you for watching to the end. See you in the next journey.